Hi guys, welcome back to a new video. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay, and if this is the first video you're watching, then you have missed the first part because this is the second part of the Glensheen Mansion murders. This video is a follow-up to what happened at the Glensheen Mansion, and in this video I will be focusing on the crimes of Marjorie Congdon. I highly recommend you watch the first part. I will link it in this video as well as in the description box below, because otherwise this video will make absolutely no sense at all. I will do a very brief overview about what happened in the previous video just to jog your memory. I am sorry I'm posting this over a week after. I'm working on call at the moment, so it makes it very difficult to find time to film and edit, so here we are. This is also the second time I filmed this video, so hopefully I'm happy with the outcome of this one. And yeah, let's just dive right in. So in the previous video, I discussed Chester Congdon, who was this mega millionaire man who had quite a few children, one of them being Elizabeth Congdon, who went on to have two daughters of her own. Well, she actually adopted two of them, Marjorie and Jennifer, and they were polar opposites. She quickly stood out from everyone else in the family, mostly because from a very young age she started exhibiting very odd behaviors that only got worse over time. Jennifer was the most liked in the entire family. She was easygoing, everybody loved her, and Marjorie always felt jealous of how easy everything was for Jennifer. With some of Marjorie's problematic behaviors, she would often steal money from Elizabeth, her mother, who didn't quite know how to handle her. And I think Elizabeth's mistake was to purchase quite a few things for Marjorie to maybe try and buy her good behavior or buy her happiness. And that quickly became a problem in Marjorie's life. She went on to have a spending addiction, and it quickly showed in her first marriage to Richard Leroy. They went on to have 7 children together, and although she did receive quite a lot of money from Elizabeth's trust, she would spend every single penny that ever came her way, and she landed her whole family in quite a lot of debt. After 20 years of marriage, Richard left. She went on to meet Roger Caldwell, who was known as an alcoholic who would often be abusive, and they ended up moving to Colorado. She moved there with her youngest, Rick, and between the fights they had, so Roger and Marjorie would fight quite a lot, mostly because of Roger's drinking problem, but also because Marjorie kept spending every penny that came her way, and that just created more financial stress. He was not working at the time, she was also not working, and that just created more tension. It got to the point where Marjorie was in severe debt, and she also wanted more money to spend. And that's why she became an immediate suspect when on June 27th, 1977, Marjorie's mother, Elizabeth, was found murdered alongside her night nurse, Velma Putila. When Jennifer found out about Elizabeth's murder, she immediately said that Marjorie did it. She was immediately suspicious of her sister. They did not get along, and Jennifer knew just how much Marjorie would stand to inherit should her mother pass away, or should their mother pass away. Jennifer wasn't the only one who was suspicious of Marjorie's involvement in the murders, because Richard had known Marjorie for 20 years. They'd been married for 21 years before he divorced her, and he knew her well enough to know that she very likely was involved in her own mother's murder, which is awful to say, but he actually wasn't surprised at all to know that this had happened. Now, before I dive into the second half of this video, so the first half was more about the background on Marjorie and the entire family, and this video is more focused on Marjorie herself. I do want to give a heads up, there will be mention of suicide, I think at 2 separate points in this video. That's about it. I believe that is the only warning you need to know. Should that be a topic you'd like to avoid, please click out. Otherwise, that's it. I'm just going to pick back up from where we left, which is when Jennifer found out about Elizabeth's murder and immediately blamed Marjorie. Now, Elizabeth's funeral had been organized and arranged by Jennifer. It was set to take place on June 30th, and there was a ceremony at the Glensheen Mansion. Now, Jennifer was way too upset to deal with the guests up until the ceremony started, so she kind of locked herself upstairs with her family. Meanwhile, Marjorie, who had always been known as the introvert of the family, was downstairs greeting people at the door. Now, obviously, this was a huge funeral. The Congdon family is massive. They all had many, many children. I mean, Marjorie herself had 7 children. Elizabeth adopted 2, but she had 5 or 6 siblings. So you can imagine this was a busy affair, and Marjorie was at the door greeting everybody, but it's unsettled so many people because she was so upbeat and happy about all of it. It just felt so inappropriate and wrong. Also, she wasn't wearing black, which was a big no-no. I understand that everybody needs to wear black for a funeral, but back then this was definitely the thing to do, and it would have horrified Elizabeth to see Marjorie turn up in anything but black. Additionally, Roger Caldwell had made an appearance. He was there with Marjorie. Again, she had dressed him head to toe as a Colorado rancher cowboy, which was not his vibe anyway, but it just felt really out of place, really inappropriate. And what was even more inappropriate was that the clothes that they had both been wearing for the funeral had been purchased by Marjorie, but she had sent the bill to her mother, so she had put the bill in her mother's name, even though her mother had already passed away, which is just disgusting behavior. But Marjorie did not have any money. She was constantly broke, and she, for some reason, thought that was appropriate to do, to just still charge her mother for the clothes she wore to her own mother's funeral. Sadly for Velma Pitila, she did not get the same grandiose funeral or attention. I think a lot of people kind of dismissed her murder. It was more about Elizabeth Congdon, which was, probably the main person that night. So sadly for Velma, she really didn't, she was kind of forgotten. She had 5 siblings, she had 3 children and 6 grandchildren, and she also left behind a husband who was absolutely devastated because if you remember in the first video, I mentioned that the night she came over to help out Elizabeth to become a night nurse, her husband tried to talk her out of it. Velma used to work for Elizabeth. She actually kind of missed seeing Elizabeth, and she was asked to show up very last minute as a favor because no one else could take care of Elizabeth that night. And her husband tried to say, look, you're retired, you don't need to go there, this is a strange mansion in the middle of nowhere, please don't go. And she's like, you know what, let me just do this once, it'll be nice to see her again, I won't do it again, it's just this one off. So of course, when the next morning her husband heard the news of his wife's murder, he was absolutely devastated because he felt like if he had insisted a little bit more, she would still be alive. And it's absolutely not his fault, but I can only imagine what he must have felt like knowing that he could have prevented this. It's absolutely heartbreaking. The Pitilas did sue the Congdon estate trustees because they felt that the mansion was left unsecured. It was not, they didn't have enough security, and if they had provided the adequate security for the mansion, this wouldn't have happened. And surprisingly, they did settle. They ended up getting $225,000, which is a huge amount of money at the time. At the end of the day, they just wanted Velma back. It really didn't bring her back, but they were satisfied with the outcome of the lawsuit. Ernie Grams, who was inspector of detectives at the Duluth PD, was also one of the first people at the scene that morning. He was in charge of Elizabeth and Velma's murder cases. Quite a few relatives had phoned him up to share their concerns regarding Marjorie. Quite a few people felt like she might have something to do with this because they knew exactly what she was like. She was constantly in debt, and they were all very aware of how much money she stood to inherit. So before he even got to meet Marjorie, he already had quite a few phone calls from people who believed she had something to gain from this. So he was quite curious to speak to her just to see, first of all, what kind of person she was like. And he didn't have to wait long. Marjorie and Roger kind of stormed into his office the day before Elizabeth's funeral to basically ask questions. She wanted to get updates on the investigation, which in itself is not particularly strange. It is very frequent for family members to turn up and ask for an update. She wanted to know if the FBI was involved. She also wanted to know if any jewelry had been stolen, which is a bit of a strange question because they had quickly determined that the murder was not a robbery gone wrong. This obviously, not much had been stolen at all. There were just a handful of items, very specific items that had gone missing. Some of them being jewelry, but really not not a huge amount. If you had gone there to commit a robbery, you would have gone for literally anything in that mansion. I mean, there was so much of value in there that had been left behind, and even if this was a murder followed up by a quick robbery, there were so many bigger items of value that you could have snatched. So yeah, he found that a bit weird. He also noticed that Roger had a cut on his lip and a swollen right hand. He just kind of took note of that detail. He also was very aware that whatever money Marjorie would be getting from the inheritance, it would pretty much pay off all of her debts, and it would also give her more money to spend, since she had such a well-known spending addiction. I don't think she was really a shopaholic. It's not like she had to buy things or hoard things. She literally had to spend every dollar in her account. Even if she didn't have money, she would try to spend money. So, you know, it wasn't necessarily on material items, but she never had any money in her name, no matter how much she made. Before leaving his office, she made sure to let him know that she tried calling her mother the Friday before she passed away. But of course, Elizabeth had already left for Brule for the weekend, so she missed out on that, but she really wanted Ernie to know that she tried phoning her mother that Friday, but she missed the boat because her mother had already left. At the time of the murders, as I've said, Marjorie had some pretty solid alibis. She was in Colorado the whole weekend. She had been speaking to realtors to buy properties. Now, this woman had absolutely no money, and she still signed 3 deeds for different properties she absolutely could not afford. And she made a promise to the realtors. She said, look, I'm an heiress and there's some money coming in really soon, even though technically there was no more money coming in from her trust. She had already spent that. She would get money every year. That had already been spent. So I don't know how she could be so convinced that more money was coming in soon. That's very strange in itself. But Roger was more vague about his whereabouts that weekend, especially that night. Now, police ended up searching the hotel room they were staying at during the funeral. They were staying at the Radisson Hotel, and inside that room they found a receipt for the 27th of June, so the day after the murder, at the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport for a shop there. And when they spoke to the staff member at the shop, she said that Roger had purchased a garment bag to put inside a wicker basket, and the wicker basket had gone missing from Elizabeth's room. So that was a huge clue. Now, to make things worse for Roger, a cab driver identified him as the person he had dropped off near the Glensheen Mansion the night before the murder, or the night of the murders. And that really kind of sealed the deal for police. And the reason there was no lift the next day was because Velma had actually driven to the mansion the night of her shift. Obviously, she had to get there somehow, but the next morning, the car had gone missing. Velma's car was nowhere to be found. It was later found at the short-term parking lot of the airport, and the keys for the car had been tossed in a trash can at the airport. The figurative nail in the coffin for Roger was an envelope that had been found at the Radisson Hotel that was addressed to himself with his own handwriting. So it looked as if he had sent himself something, and inside that envelope was a Byzantine, I'm not saying that right, an old coin, a really old coin that was dated 380. So basically a collector's coin that had also gone missing from Elizabeth's room, that was in an envelope addressed to Roger Caldwell, which had his own handwriting on it, which made him look incredibly guilty, of course. Police were quite happy to see there was a fingerprint on that envelope. They were quite convinced that it would come back as a match to Roger, and everything was really pointing towards Roger. Obviously, he didn't really have an alibi for the night of the murder, and all these things were kind of pointing back at him or to him. So police were quite happy to arrest him. He was arrested on July 7th for the murders of Velma and Elizabeth. While he was waiting in jail for the trial to begin, Anne Payne, who was Marjorie's friend as a child, they had gone horseback riding together quite a lot, and even Manette, the figure skating coach, who was good friends with Marjorie back then, they genuinely could not believe what they were seeing in the news. They refused to believe that Marjorie could have anything to do with this. They were horrified, and they defended their friend. They really, wanted to be there for Marjorie. Now, since Marjorie was in the area around the time of the funeral and around the time Roger got arrested, she basically was near where Manette used to live, and Manette was like, you know what, she probably needs a friend right now. Let me reach out to her and basically just check in on her, see how she's doing. Obviously, Manette assumed that Marjorie would be devastated not only by her mother's murder, but the fact that her husband was now in jail because he was suspected as the murderer. When she got there, first of all, she couldn't believe how much Marjorie had changed. She had always dressed kind of like prim and proper. She was always really nicely dressed, but now when she met Marjorie, she looked completely different. She had really short hair. She was dressed as like a Colorado cowgirl. It's not that she didn't look good, it's just that she looked completely different. It was such a weird style on her, so Manette was like, oh, okay. And instead of like being upset about her mother's murder, Marjorie kept mentioning her whereabouts that weekend. And Manette was like, you know what? She kind of brushed it off. She's like, look, she's going through a lot, so I'm not going to focus on that. But she did find it very weird that Marjorie would spend more time talking about her alibi than anything else, because it's not like Manette suspected her. She knew her friend had nothing to do with this. But a few days later, she got to see a completely different side to Marjorie, because a few days later, Marjorie phoned her in a hysterical panic. She begged her to come over, to rush over, because a man had just barged into her house. She was actually staying at her son's house, but someone had barged in and attacked her with a razor. And of course, Manette rushed over, but when she got there, everything felt very off. The cuts were very superficial. There were blood prints on the walls inside the house, but there was no trail of blood between the rooms where the blood was, right? It looked like someone had gone into a room, put blood prints on the wall, and then kind of gone to another room, put blood prints on the wall. It just didn't seem like an actual assault scene. It just seemed very, very, very off. And actually, Manette felt very uncomfortable. She just wanted to leave, so Marjorie asked her to give her a lift to her attorney's office, and Manette was like, fine, get in the car, dropped her off, and then just bailed because she was like, this is so bizarre. And she couldn't believe it when she read the newspaper the next day, because Marjorie had spoken to the Duluth Herald as well as her attorney, and she said that a man with a badge and a gun had broken into the house where she was staying at and basically attacked her with a razor and threatened her to come back for more if she didn't defend her husband. Which is so strange, because it's not like she wasn't defending him, so I'm not sure what this was all about. But what was so concerning is that she had actually phoned someone else before calling Manette. She had phoned another friend, and her friend was like, yeah, I'm not coming over, sounds serious though, call 911. But I don't know, the friend just didn't come over. Instead of phoning 911, she called Manette. So again, very strange. Surely the first person or the first number you would dial after an assault would be 911, but she didn't. Now, again, she was very quick to defend Roger, her husband. She was very quick to say that he was being framed, he wasn't the murderer, how could you do this? She insisted that she was in Colorado at the time, but her husband's innocent. She was more than happy to give a million interviews. She was loving the attention, and when interviewers were like, so where was Roger, the night of the murders? She was like, well, I don't know where he was the night of the murders, but I can tell you he woke me up at 6 a.m. on the 27th, so there's no way he could have gone from Colorado to the Glensheen Mansion and back in time to wake her up at 6 in the morning, so don't worry about it, guys, he's innocent, which, didn't make him sound innocent at all, but basically she was not really defending him, but also kind of defending him. She made sure to tell the newspaper and the interviewers that she was being taken advantage of. She had no money. She had to resort to food banks for food. She was really depressed, and her husband was being framed, and she was basically all alone. She tried to paint her husband in a good way. Now, I think a lot of people close to Marjorie and Roger, not that there were many people, knew that they fought a lot. They really didn't actually have much in common. They didn't really love each other at all. I think a lot of people were confused as to what they were doing together, but I think they met when they were both lonely and wanted company, and it turned out it was the worst kind of company. But she tried to paint him in a good light and said, well, he's an amazing father to Rick, my youngest. He bought him a horse and a car when I couldn't afford it. And I think some people were like, hold up, he's an unemployed alcoholic. How could he afford a horse and a car for your son? Also, you're married. If you're broke, he's probably broke too. I don't know. It's just bizarre. But she did kind of tried to defend him. Now, police didn't believe her for a second. They knew she had so much to gain from her mother's death. She stood to inherit over $4 million, an additional $50,000 a year on top of all of the other trusts she already had. If you remember from the first video, she was already making probably about like over $50,000 a year just in interest alone. She didn't work. And that didn't count a share of the $45 million in assets that Elizabeth had, so she really stood to inherit so much money. And Elizabeth was quite a smart woman. She knew Marjorie very well. Unfortunately, she couldn't control her daughter anymore, but she knew what Marjorie was like with money, so basically she set up the will so that her jewelry would be split between the two daughters. Jennifer and Marjorie could kind of fight over what they wanted in terms of jewelry, but when it came to money, Jennifer would get the inheritance money right away because Jennifer didn't have a money problem, whereas Marjorie's inheritance money would go through a trust, which infuriated Marjorie. She was absolutely furious when she found out that Elizabeth had set up the will that way, and she tried to fight the will to the point where Jennifer was like, actually, you know what? If it means that Marjorie gets nothing, I'm ready to get nothing as well. Jennifer was willing to give up millions of dollars and her mother's jewelry if it meant that Marjorie wouldn't get a cent. Because unlike Marjorie, Jennifer wanted her mother back. She didn't want the money. She would rather have her mother than her mother's money. Just before Roger's trial started, 5 of Marjorie's 7 children made private depositions against her, and they said that if she was even remotely involved in Elizabeth's death, she should not inherit anything, which also meant that they probably wouldn't inherit anything, but they genuinely believed that their mother could have something to do with this, which speaks volumes. Rick, the youngest, and Stephen, the eldest, were the only 2 who stood by Marjorie and Roger. I have no idea why. I understand Rick was the youngest. He spent the most time with Marjorie and even Roger. I understand how maybe he had a different point of view of Marjorie, but Stephen had been kicked out by Marjorie multiple times. She was awful to him. Not sure why he decided to defend them. They tried to highlight how generous Marjorie was. She'd made a 5 by 10 feet, like a big ass needlepoint rug. She had handmade that for Elizabeth, who preferred handmade gifts. It's not like Marjorie could afford to buy any gifts for her mom anyway. She was always broke. But she had made a beautiful rug for her mom and spent ages on it. And I think the sons were trying to argue that why would you murder someone who you're willing to spend hours on a project for? Like, they were flawless logic. But they basically were trying to highlight that, Marjorie never spoke ill of Elizabeth, which I guess she did only speak ill of her in front of certain people, but in front of others, she would only say good things about her mother. I do want to point out, now this is in the future, but in 1983, Marjorie ended up getting $1.5 million from her mother's inheritance, and then her children got $6 million to split evenly. Also, even though Marjorie's own children, most of her own children, thought she might be involved, she still had a few friends who wanted to defend her. Manette still believed she was innocent and had nothing to do with this. So did Anne Payne, but also so did Helen and Wally Hagen. Now, I did tell you in the first video to remember these names because it will be important later, but Helen and Wally had been, so basically they met when their kids were still doing ice skating together, so the kids knew each other as well. And Helen had been a good friend to Marjorie, and Marjorie had been a good friend to Helen, and Helen made sure to contact Marjorie, get back in touch with her to say, hey, we know you're innocent, we're here if you need a hand, we're here for you, don't worry about it, it's gonna be fine. Now, Roger's trial started on May 8th, 1978, and although Marjorie had spent all this time doing interviews shouting Roger's innocence, she did not show up a single time in court. She was nowhere to be seen during the trial, and it's not like she was a busy single mom working a job. She had no children to take care of. Literally, they had all grown up, and she didn't work. She never showed up. She never showed up to defend her husband. Anyway. Absolutely wild. She did hire a defense attorney for her husband. She hired Doug Thompson, who absolutely hated her guts. which didn't matter. He was there to defend Roger, not Marjorie, but he thought she was shrill, invasive, annoying. She was just the worst, which is interesting. But he was the defense attorney for Roger. Marjorie got one for herself. She got Ronald Meshbesher to defend herself. He was a terrific defense attorney. And John DeSanto was the one who was on the side of the prosecution. Now, he gave a 2-hour opening statement basically claiming that Roger killed Elizabeth because he could no longer handle the financial pressure Marjorie had created by her spending problem. And basically the whole crime was motivated by money, which is a very common motive for murder. He highlighted all of the evidence that was pointing to Roger, so I've already covered some of that, but he also told the court that 3 days before Elizabeth was murdered, Marjorie changed the will so that Roger stood to inherit over $2.5 million from Elizabeth's inheritance. So basically, he would get a $2.5 million share of Marjorie's inheritance, which is a huge amount of money. It's not something you can just ignore. And that meant that he would directly stand to gain financially from Elizabeth's death. There was also blood found at the scene, and John DeSanto said it was a match, but this was before DNA, so I'm not sure what kind of match they did back then, especially given that all three, so Roger, Elizabeth, and Velma had the same blood type, so it would be even harder to separate, the profiles of blood, but this was before DNA. They also found 3 hairs at the crime scene that John DeSanto said were a match or similar to Roger's, and that his right thumbprint was found on the envelope containing the gold antique coin. There was a broken window in the basement of Glensheen Mansion, which is where police believe the point of entry was, and they spent most of the trial trying to see if Roger had long enough arms to get through the hole in the window and open the latch so he could enter that way. That was most of the trial, like trying to figure out if they recreated the whole window and the hole in the window just to see if his arm was long enough to open the latch. And those are just like some of the highlights of the case, obviously, or of the trial, because I have so much more to talk about. So, I could make a whole video about the actual trial itself, but I do want to just stick to the biggest details and the highlights. When it was Doug Thompson's turn to defend his client Roger, he basically completely obliterated some of the evidence. He said that the handwriting found on the envelope actually was not a match to Roger Caldwell's handwriting at all. So that was already, disproving some of the clues. And basically there was 12 weeks of back and forth, but John DeSanto tried to prove that Roger Caldwell had committed this murder or these murders and left all of this evidence behind because he was a careless drunk, whereas Doug Thompson was trying to say, like, look, he's not an idiot, and if he had committed these murders, he wouldn't leave all these obvious clues that don't actually lead back to him. Like, most of them are inconsistent with like, for example, the handwriting wasn't his, things like that. So he was very obviously being framed. During all 12 weeks, Roger didn't say a single word, and he only spoke once he was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the murders of Velma and Elizabeth. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences, and all he ever said after the verdict was, "You're wrong, and I'm not guilty of these charges." Now, John DeSanto was quite satisfied with the outcome. However, he genuinely did not believe that Roger was behind this scheme at all. He didn't believe that Roger would be able to pull this off on his own or even come up with the idea himself, and he fully intended on going after Marjorie as well. So on July 11th, 1978, Marjorie was charged with conspiring with her husband to murder her own mother. Now, this time around, Ronald Meshbesher, who was Marjorie's criminal defense attorney, had a bigger role. He didn't have a huge role in Roger's trial, but this time, obviously, the trial was about Marjorie, and he was one of the best defense lawyers. This was a very long trial. It lasted 16 weeks. I think DeSanto thought he really had an easy case, like this was going to be so obvious. He did bring up quite a few solid arguments. He brought in Dr. Bagley, who basically recounted the entire story about how Marjorie had put tranquilizers in the jam and tried to poison her own mother. He also brought up the fact that the ring stolen the night of the murder was the one Marjorie had wanted badly. She had stopped by Glensheen Mansion I guess a few months before, and she had made a huge fuss about wanting that very specific ring, and that was one of the very, very few items that had gone missing from the mansion that night. He also insisted that Marjorie desperately needed money to pay off her debts, but also so she could spend more money, and that obviously she would be getting millions in inheritance, and you couldn't just dismiss that. That's a huge motive, because aside from Marjorie and Roger, there were no other suspects. Like, that's the thing. It's not like there were other people who could have done this. There was absolutely no rhyme or reason behind Elizabeth and Velma's murders. So this was really just Roger versus Marjorie. Now, Meshbesher basically painted Roger as an untrustworthy alcoholic who was abusive. He said that Marjorie was very depressed, and he basically brought Rick to the stand to defend his own mother. He said, look, she's an amazing person. She moved us all to Colorado because of my asthma, and it kind of saved my life. She put me in this clinic that really helped me with my breathing, and she's a loving mother. She wouldn't do anything like that. Basically tried to portray Marjorie in a better light. I don't know if there were that many people who were willing to go, take the stand and defend Marjorie. She had quite a few enemies. Like, nobody on Elizabeth's side of the family liked Marjorie. No one liked her. But just before the trial ended, Meshbesher brought in a fingerprint expert who basically obliterated the whole Roger's right thumbprint on the envelope angle. So it was a very interesting move, because basically this is not Roger's fingerprint at all on the envelope. We don't know whose it is, but it's not his. Basically, Roger had mainly been convicted because of that fingerprint, and now the fingerprint was actually incorrect, so that meant that Roger might be innocent. And if Roger might be innocent, then how could Marjorie be conspiring with him to commit this murder? So basically this created a whole lot of doubt. And DeSanto, it didn't help, but John DeSanto botched his closing argument. For whatever reason, he never brought up the fires that seemed to start around Marjorie, like the fact that she had set her entire garage on fire once. She also set one of her houses on fire for insurance money. Now, obviously, she was never found guilty of that, but only because... Well, actually, yeah, she was found guilty of setting her house on fire, but she couldn't be charged because the insurance had lapsed, and that meant that she couldn't be charged for fraud if there was no insurance to defraud. Does that make sense? So she had actually set her house on fire. So all of these things, including the break-in at the Brule summer house that had happened a few weeks before, so he never brought that up, and it was so strange because those would have been really compelling arguments. And Meshbesher's closing argument was just way more captivating, way more interesting. He spoke for over 4 hours, and he kept the jury listening. He kept them interested. He went on and destroyed every single bit of evidence that he could, and the ones he couldn't destroy, he basically created doubt. And it worked, because on July 21st, 1979, Marjorie was found not guilty on all accounts. She was acquitted. Because of the new evidence mentioned in her trial, that meant that Roger was granted a new trial for the murders he was accused of. Now, instead of being acquitted, what they did was they convicted him of 2 second-degree murders instead of 2 first-degree murders, and they decided to suspend the rest of his sentence. So he had already spent 5 years in jail, and now he was free, but still guilty. So he was free to roam the earth, but the one condition he had was that he had to take the stand and basically confess to the murders. Now, he told the story, he confessed to the murders, basically. He confirmed what they all knew. He said that Marjorie was the one behind the whole plan. She was the mastermind behind it. But he also said that at the time he was drinking quite heavily, and especially that night, so he didn't remember everything. So he basically told them everything he could remember, and I think they quickly realized that a lot of it didn't add up. It was very strange. Basically, he said he broke into the house through that window, and once he realized there was no alarm or security, he made his way through the house. He was trying to remember the layout, because obviously he'd only been there once for 15 minutes, but Marjorie had explained the whole layout of the house, and he knew Elizabeth slept on the first floor, so he made his way upstairs, but didn't expect to bump into Velma, who started screaming, so he quickly needed to silence her, and he grabbed the closest item he could find, which was a brass candlestick, and he beat her until she lay way still. Now, he made his way to Elizabeth's room where Elizabeth was sleeping, and of course she was paralyzed on half of her body was paralyzed, so she couldn't move, but she must have seen Roger approaching, and he decided to smother her with a pillow until he was sure that she had died. Now, the things that don't add up is the fact that he said he never did this for the money. He said he did this for Marjorie. Now, obviously, we know that he stood to gain quite a lot of money from this, but also it didn't make sense that he would do this for Marjorie. They clearly didn't love each other. They weren't a loving couple, so why would he do this for someone he didn't really like anyways? Like, you're not going to commit murder for someone you're kind of like, meh about. So that didn't add up. And then he said that she was, the mastermind behind this plan, but that she was the one who picked him up from the airport on the 27th, as opposed to her saying he woke her up at 6 a.m. that morning. He said, no, she picked me up from the airport. She thought I was on a bender and she didn't want to know what I had been up to. So basically, she didn't ask any questions. But when she picked him up from the airport, she would already have found out about her mother's murder. So you're telling me this lady who is behind this whole plan didn't know where you were that night. And when she picked you up, she didn't have any questions whatsoever. Like, strange. A lot of it didn't make sense, especially because after the trial he was like, well, you're wrong, I'm innocent. And then he went on to basically confirm that he did it. So they were like, well, how can you say you're innocent if you actually did it? So anyway, it was very strange, but he was now free to go. He moved back to his hometown. Obviously, he and Marjorie were done, but they did not divorce. I do want to mention that years later, on May 17th, 1988, he was found dead of self-inflicted wounds in his apartment. So he had basically committed suicide because after years of very, very solid depression, he just could no longer deal with what had happened at the Glensheen Mansion. So that is obviously way ahead in the storyline, but I did want to mention that Roger eventually did commit suicide because of what had happened. And so, to this day, some people actually don't believe he was alone that night or that he even was there that night. Some people genuinely doubt his involvement with the murders. I think there is enough evidence to prove that he definitely was there that night, but that's just a side note. Now, meanwhile, Helen Hagen, let's talk about Helen. Marjorie's old friend from the ice skating days was getting progressively sicker. Now, physically, she was very, very healthy, but she had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and it got to the point where her daughter Nancy and her husband Wally figured she would be better in a nursing home. She needed professional support for her Alzheimer's. They could no longer be the sole carers or caregivers, so they put her in a nursing home, and Nancy would visit all the time. She was very close to her mother. She would always drop by the nursing home and talk to her. And one day, Nancy was speaking to Helen, and Helen dropped a bomb on her. She said that she believed Wally was having an affair with Marjorie, which absolutely shocked Nancy, because it's not that she thought very highly of Marjorie, but she definitely didn't think her dad would ever get involved in an affair, so she couldn't believe her mom would accuse her own husband. But actually, because she had Alzheimer's, she would often substitute words and use the wrong words for whatever it is or whatever it was that she meant. So actually, initially, Nancy was like, oh, she's not talking about an affair, she's trying to say something else. And Helen was actually quite clear of mind when she was telling Nancy this. She's like, no, I honestly genuinely believe something's up. It's really concerning, and also, they take me out to lunch and they literally leave me on my own for an hour. They just vanish together and then they come back, and she's like, I don't know what they're up to, but that's strange. So she just had a gut feeling. On March 26th, 1980, Nancy had spent hours at the nursing home feeding her mother dinner. She needed help eating foods, and she could mostly only eat very soft foods. So Nancy had dropped by just to speak to her mom. She had spent hours there, and it was such a lovely time. She was telling her mom all about her son Michael, and she was feeding her dinner, and she said that this was a really, really good night because this was one of the few nights where Helen was very clear of mind. She could remember everyone, she could have a full conversation with her, and if you know anyone who, or if you've ever dealt with anyone who has Alzheimer's, you know how precious those moments are where the person is basically clear-minded and knows what's going on. You just treasure these moments. And Nancy was just so happy with the visit. Now, what she didn't know is shortly after she left the nursing home, Marjorie dropped by to pay her good friend Helen a visit. Marjorie fed her some mashed bananas that had been laced with meprobamate, which was the exact same tranquilizer she had used in the jam with her mother. Now, this time around, she had learned her lesson. She had initially tried to kill her mother with the jam a few years prior, but basically she didn't give a strong enough dosage, and this time around she knew just how much to give to make sure that Helen would never wake up. Helen must have realized that something was off because meprobamate tastes very bitter and the mashed bananas were not sweet enough to hide the bitterness, but there wasn't much she could do. And what's absolutely awful was that while Helen was being fed mashed bananas, Marjorie decided to tell her all about her affair with Wally, her husband. She said that he had never loved her, that he absolutely hated making love to her, and that Marjorie knew exactly what her husband loved. And she basically said that they had fallen in love immediately since the first day they met. The affair had been going on for ages, and that she was tired of waiting for Helen to die so that she could be with Wally. And I can only imagine what it must have felt like to stand in that bed and to feel like you're probably being poisoned, and then your good friend is telling you these awful, awful things that are absolutely crushing you. The next morning, the nursing home phoned Nancy to let her know that Helen had slipped into a coma, which absolutely shocked Nancy because Helen had been doing so well the night before. It really puzzled her, as well as the doctors. The doctors couldn't understand how this happened. So Nancy quickly rushed to the nursing home with her father, who randomly mentioned that if Helen was ever to be put on life support, they should say no, they should decline, should it ever come to that. And Nancy was like, what are you talking about? She's gonna pull through, it's gonna be fine. How could you say such a thing? It was awful. And she got to the nursing home, and Nancy was checking her mother's charts or whatever, and she found out that Marjorie was the one who was listed as Helen's daughter. And Nancy spoke to the nurse, and she's like, first of all, actually, Nancy didn't even know Marjorie came by, even knew that her mother was in a nursing home. She didn't know Marjorie was paying her mom visits. But basically, she spoke to the nurse and said, I'm Helen's daughter, not Marjorie. Why is she listed as her emergency contact, and why is she listed as her daughter? And the nurse was like, I don't know, she just said she was her daughter, so we just took that at face value. Actually, she was there just the night before. She was there feeding your mom baby food, and that's immediately when Nancy knew that Marjorie was behind this. Very sadly, Helen passed away on March 30th, 1980 at the very young age of 64 years old, and doctors genuinely had no idea what was going on. They couldn't figure out how she could have gone from perfectly physically healthy to slipping into a coma and not waking up from it. It did not make any sense. And just a week after, 7 whole days after Helen passed away, Wally dropped by Nancy's place and he dropped a bomb on her. He told her, Marge is out in the car. I just came to tell you that I hated your mother for the whole 47 years we were married, which was the most devastating thing Nancy had ever heard. She was convinced that, her parents had been madly in love. She knew Helen loved Wally, but she never expected Wally to ever confess to such a horrible thing. And he just basically left with Marjorie, and that was just the beginning of the end. He basically was turned into a completely different person. Marjorie basically convinced him that he didn't even need to pick up his grandson Michael from school when it was his turn to look after his grandkid, which left Nancy in horrible positions because she would get a call from the school being like, no one picked up your son, what's going on? It was absolutely awful. And shortly after Helen passed away, someone broke into Nancy's house to steal the will, and she also found out that the money she had been given her father to help pay for the nursing home and the bills had never basically gone to the bills. He actually had been giving all of the money to Marjorie. On August 7th, 1981, Marjorie and Wally got married in North Dakota. Now, at the time, Marjorie was still married to Roger. They hadn't actually divorced, and she had to falsify divorce papers in order to marry Wally, even though she hadn't actually divorced. So if she ever returned to North Dakota, she could be charged for bigamy. The newlywed couple moved to Mound, Minnesota, which is the town where Wally and Helen had started their family and brought up their kids, which is a psychotic move on Marjorie's part. Of course, this was her idea. And once they moved there, they bought a house that they couldn't afford, but they basically had 1 year to pay off the deed. So because Marjorie was constantly broke when it came time to pay the deed, she didn't have the money, and she figured, actually, do you know what? If we sell this house, we can make $30,000 in profit, and then with that money, we can buy another house. So they decided to sell the house to the Larsons. Now, we don't know the Larsons. They're just a couple who unfortunately wanted to just buy a house, and they decided to buy from Marjorie and Wally. They were set to move in on September 1st, but Marjorie was like, actually guys, give me 2 weeks to just deep clean this house, and they weren't too much in a rush to move in, so they kind of like allowed her to do some home renovations before moving in. They were like, fine, but they still had keys to the house, so every once in a while they would drop by just to see what was going on inside their new house. And they walked in, and basically what Marjorie and Wally had done was they had varnished every single room, like all the floors in every single room had been varnished, but they had done a horrible job of it. Basically, they didn't hoover, they didn't vacuum, they didn't sweep anything. They just kind of like varnished everything straight onto the floor, like on the dirt, just kind of like my landlord just kind of painted over my light switch like a savage. They were doing an awful job of it. The whole house smelled like very, very strong chemicals, and the Larsons were not impressed. So once they saw what kind of job they were doing, they're like, actually, Marjorie, put the hammer down. You've done enough. Like, we can renovate this house ourselves. We want to move in early. So they decided to move a day early. And basically the couples were set to have dinner together to celebrate the selling of the house and the purchase of the house together. And before going to that dinner, the Larsons dropped by one last time before their move-in day just to check in on the house. And this time it was even worse. There were opened cans of paint lining the walls. It still smelled really strongly. They hadn't like aired out the house at all. They just were devastated by the mess. So they decided to just lock the door, like lock the house up, go to that dinner, maybe bring it up to Marjorie and say like, or Marjorie and Wally and say, what the hell were you guys thinking? Like, you've done an awful job and it's going to take us longer to undo your home renovations. But actually they got to dinner and they were terrified of Marjorie. She was acting very erratic all night. She was kind of just stressing them out and scaring them. So they're like, actually, you know what? Let's just not bring it up. So they had this dinner together and they just basically went their separate ways. The next morning, unfortunately, the Larsons were informed that their new house had burned down to the ground. Marjorie had been actually seen that morning at the time of the fire. She was driving in her car and passing through the neighborhood, and she asked a neighbor if they knew what had gone on, like if they knew what the fire was all about. But I don't know if she genuinely thought she was incognito. She was wearing a little headscarf and some sunglasses, and she was like, excuse me, do you know what's going on with this house? And the guy was like, Marjorie, ma'am, this is your house and it's on fire. And she was like, oh, actually, that's not our house. We sold it 2 weeks ago, and then drove off, which is just alarming. Of course, Marjorie and Wally were immediate suspects in this case. And on October 6th, 1982, agents Ray DePrima and Pat Shannon made their way to Wally and Marjorie's house to ask some questions and maybe pick up any relevant documentation or paperwork that had anything to do with the house that they had just sold, but also that had also just burned down. They started asking Wally questions. Marjorie wasn't home yet, but when she got home from her quilting club, she absolutely lost it. She went full Karen on them. She's like, you have no right to be at my house. You have no right to ask me or my husband any questions, which they absolutely did. And she basically turned into a dragon. She was breathing down their necks. She was very, very anxious about them looking through her house for paperwork. She tried to disrupt the whole search as much as she could. They asked her where she had been the morning of the fires, and she gave her own version of events, but they knew she probably was lying because they asked her if she was divorced, if she had divorced Roger, and she said she had, when they knew fine well that she had never signed the paperwork for the divorce. But they made their way through the house. They found some documents, they found some paperwork, some unpaid bills, And as they were getting ready to leave, they noticed Marjorie slipping a key down her pants. And they were like, Marjorie, hand it over. What is it? So she reluctantly gave them the key, which happened to be a copy of the house they had just sold. And which is interesting because, as you remember, the Larsons had locked the house before going to dinner, and the next day when the house was found burning down, the door was unlocked, and Marjorie and Wally had promised the agents that they had given every single copy of the keys to the Larsons, when clearly she still had a copy available. This wasn't enough to prove anything. The agents knew they needed more damning evidence, so basically they waited until they received the insurance money for the house to strike. In January 1983, Marjorie and Wally got the money from the insurance company for the house that burned down, and that's when the agents gathered as many search warrants as they could, as well as arrest warrants, because they fully expected Wally and Marjorie to run away, to run away to a different state. And they were right, because they got there just in time to basically interrupt their sweet escape. And Marjorie was arrested for second-degree arson and for defrauding an insurance company. The trial started in December of that year, so December 1983. And up until then, actually, she was free without bond. She was just kind of roaming the earth. She didn't run away, but she wasn't held in jail, which was an interesting move. But Marjorie and Wally were actually living in a trailer without running water or a sewage connection, which was, a vast contrast to the Glensheen Mansion she had grown up in. And she was looking after her husband, who had just gotten heart surgery. A month after the trial began, Marjorie was found guilty of burning down the house for insurance money, and she got a 2.5-year sentence as well as a $10,000 fine. She actually did very well in prison. It was a brand new prison that had like arts and crafts rooms and things like that. She got along with the inmates. She taught them needlepoint. She read a lot. I think it helped that she had access to her money, but she didn't have the opportunity to spend as much. So maybe that helped. I'm not sure. But she got released 10 months early for good behavior. And once she was released, she grabbed her husband, grabbed the trailer, and they drove down to Ajo, Arizona, where they bought a tiny mining house. The town of Ajo was basically developed by Chester Congdon when he was doing his mining business. This was just a very, very, very tiny town at the time, and he turned into a mining town because of Chester Congdon, and that's how it had developed. So that's probably why Marjorie chose to move there. She maybe felt like she wanted to reconnect with her grandfather, although technically she was adopted, but she never got to meet her grandfather. She quite enjoyed living close to the Mexican border because Wally was quite older than her. He was, I want to say, up to 20 years older than her, and he basically wasn't doing great. He had some health problems, and she could easily get alternative medication or alternative medicine from Mexico, so that was quite good. And also, obviously, it's a very sunny, dry place, so that is always nice for older people. They love that shit. So they were living there, but for the first year and a half after they moved there, 43 fires had been started throughout the small town, which terrified the people, because the people who lived there were mostly elderly people. There was virtually zero crime in that area. It was a very peaceful small town, and as soon as Marjorie and Wally moved there, fires started happening in people's backyards, in libraries, things like that. And on March 24th, 1991, Marjorie was caught trying to set fire to her neighbor's house while he was inside the house, which is how she got caught. He overheard, he heard some noise in the backyard and phoned police, and they managed to catch her red-handed trying to start a fire. And the way she had tried to start the fire basically was so similar to the other fires throughout the town that she was suspected of not only setting fire to her neighbor's house, but also the other 43 fires. Interestingly, while Marjorie was waiting in jail for her trial to start, Wally was getting better. So he had all these health problems, but once Marjorie had left the house, he was doing fine, almost as if the medication she was giving him was what was making him sick. So that was very interesting, but he stood by her. He defended her to the very end. He thought she was innocent of every single thing, every single accusation that had been made against her. She was, a perfect person who would never do anything wrong. The jury didn't share Wally's opinion of her, and on June 11th, 1993, 60-year-old Marjorie got sentenced to 15 years in prison for the fires and also for trying to set her neighbor's house on fire while knowing fine well he was still inside the house. She did try to play the victim, but this was a very different area. This was the south of the States. Nobody really knew her. She didn't have a support system there. She didn't have witnesses to, testify on her good nature. And also, people didn't fall for her lies. They saw right through her. They didn't feel bad for her, not even once. So that's why she didn't get away with her crimes this time. And she was actually granted 24 hours of freedom because she needed a plan for Wally, because she was going to be away for 15 years and he couldn't kind of survive on his own. She needed to think of something to help him out before she left him, and she had some very, very sinister plans. The same night, she basically put him to bed, she tucked him in, and the next morning she gave him 2 tranquilizers that he was used to taking. So I'm not sure if he knew that they were tranquilizers she was giving him, but he was used to taking 2 pills in the morning. However, the beverage she gave him to take those pills had 6 pills of Xanax diluted in it. It didn't take long for him to fall asleep or even pass out. He was absolutely knocked out, and she decided to hook the garden hose to the gas stove, turn on the gas, and tape the hose to his nostrils. And she basically sat next to him and waited until she was sure he had passed away. She then got up, wrote a joint suicide letter, and basically said they loved each other too much to be apart. They couldn't deal with her going to jail. They decided to end their lives together. And then she waited a few hours before calling police, and basically when police arrived, she was like, "Oh my God, look at this letter that she wrote. We were supposed to commit suicide together, but I got cold feet." So she didn't kill herself. It was just him. And of course, police were immediately suspicious of this whole situation. She did get arrested for second-degree murder, or on suspicion of second-degree murder. She absolutely was not bothered. She knew that she was going to jail for a long time anyway, so she wasn't concerned about that. She actually never got convicted for Wally's death or murder, which is absolutely insane to me. And she did still have to go to jail for the arson case, so obviously she was still going to jail for 15 years, but instead of just going to jail and finally leaving people alone, she still tried to fight with Wally's family for his ashes, which is absolutely disgusting. His children wanted to bring him back home, at least in an urn. They wanted to be able to bury them next to Helen, and she fought them. It was a 3-year-long legal battle, and they ended up settling for half of the ashes. So Wally's children got half, and she got half. Which is absolutely disgusting on her part, because of course Wally's children knew fine well she was the one who had murdered their father, and she got away with it. In January 2004, Marjorie was released from prison after only serving 10 of the 15 years for the arson. Now in March 2008, she got arrested again. She was 76. She got arrested for forgery and fraud. She had been suspected of murdering her good friend Roger Samus, and she fraudulently received an inheritance check with his forged signature on it. So obviously she was arrested for forging his signature and receiving the inheritance fraudulently, but she couldn't be convicted of murder because he had already been cremated, so they couldn't prove that part. But I think everybody knew that that was her end goal. People knew her reputation. At some point in her life, Marjorie had been diagnosed as a psychopath, probably even twice, because Elizabeth never shared the outcome of the evaluation she asked her daughter to take when she was younger, but she was diagnosed as a psychopath, and it makes sense. I mean, it does add up. I have got to say, she is hands down the most fascinating character I've read about, that I've researched. Obviously not in a good way, but I must say the fact that she got away with so much is mind-boggling to me. It's absolutely insane. And you know what really gets me is that she was adopted possibly by one of the best people on the planet. Elizabeth was such an amazing person. She was such a caring mother. And while Jennifer made the most of her situation, Marjorie seemed to basically ruin everything Elizabeth had set up for her. I mean, she was brought into the Congdon empire, like she was set for life. it's insane that she blew it away. She basically had such a bad spending addiction that she ruined every single opportunity to be rich and live a wonderful life. It's just mind-boggling to me that someone with that much opportunity ended up the way she did. But, you know, maybe that was always going to be the case. It would be fascinating to see an alternate universe where she had been adopted by someone else, to see if she would turn into a completely different person or not, if she would still go on to do horrible things. It's hard to tell. We'll never know. As far as I'm concerned, she's still alive, though she is obviously very old. She must be in her 80s, close to her 90s by now, so not sure what she's up to, but she definitely should have spent her entire life in jail, far away from people, because she ruined so many people's lives, like, just by being connected to them. It's absolutely horrendous, some of the things she's done. It just blows my mind. And yet to this day, you know, once she got out of jail and she moved somewhere else, she still made friends. Like, some of her neighbors actually did get along with her. She had an ability to be friendly to people. She just chose to go after what she wanted, even if it meant commit crimes and murders. It's just wild. So anyway, this is it for today's video and for the Glensheen Mansion murders case. So let me know what you thought. Let me know how you feel about this case. If you've made it this far, honestly, thank you so much, especially if you've watched the full first video and you've made it this far on the second one. It was a lot of work researching this, but it was also very interesting to learn about this whole story because I haven't really seen much about it online, and I was excited to share it with you, and I finally have. So please comment down below if you want to help me pick my next case. I'm not sure what the next video is going to be about yet, but if you enjoy this type of content, please join the family, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.